guys are going to be breaking records at some point.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm actually really glad you brought up Westside, because there's quite a few things that I wanted to touch on that I've seen you write on a fair bit. And one of them was speed training, particularly in strength sports. So this is something that I've seen a lot of people talk about from a lot of different angles. But in my opinion, it's sort of, I don't think many people have done a very good job at really expressing the relevance of speed training for strength sports in general, both from like a kind of mechanistic perspective as well as more of a practical perspective. And so I was wondering if you could give some examples or instances where implementation would be beneficial, particular strategies of implementation, and also where they might want to utilize that in their sort of competitive cycle, if it's in the off season more, if it's in season, or if you can do it year round, stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it all gets down to context, right? Yes, for some people are going to be saying that there's been a debate for at least 15 years about, like if dynamic effort is actually useful or not. And both sides have valid points, but both sides don't have the full, complete picture. Now, the one side that says you don't need dynamic effort because we've got, this is a strength sport and it's 1RM, and the only thing that matters is the low gear grind of being able to push that out and have your maximum motor recruitment and as much cross-sectional area as you can. Well, that's true, but whenever you get really heavy, how are you going to refine your technique? You're not. You're going to always go back to the least common denominator. You're going to go back to the, water flows through a river a certain way for a reason. It doesn't go uphill. It doesn't go in directions that would be difficult to it. It finds the easiest route. Well, just like that, your muscle forces are going to be going for the easiest route to complete the job, right? So that's the way that you're going to be doing it. Now, dynamic effort allows you to go on a lighter load so that you could enhance that technique. Now, the other side of it. Power is something that's super important, and it seems like power doesn't matter what sport you're in, even if it's a 1RM sport like powerlifting, which honestly, that's not the best term for it, but if you go back to the original reason of why it was named that way, it makes sense. It's not correct, but it makes sense, because of lack of terminology and things like that back in 1964. But whenever we get down to it, we know that from Kaneko's work in 1983, where they used actually a method that an exercise physiologist got the Nobel Prize for, which I still think is incredible to this day. I think, I don't know if anybody's in exercise phys after A.B. Hill has won it. But we know that there's different ways that you adapt to different styles of training. In Kaneko's paper, they looked at a unloaded, so everybody did bicep curls, and they only trained one way for the entire study. So there would be a group of people who trained at an unloaded condition, a group of people who trained at a 30% of 1RM, a group of people who trained at 60% of 1RM, and a group of people who trained at 100% of 1RM. And they looked at how they produce force, how they produce velocity, and how the product of power was then derived. And what they found was if you train at 100% of 1RM, you have a great improvement in force, a small improvement in velocity, and then that means a decent improvement, an all right improvement in power, but power also shifts to the right as far as time goes. So you might not be able to call upon that power in a sport-specific activity if we're talking about team sports or individual sports that are outside of strength sports. Because in the strength sports it doesn't matter. Well, Olympic weightlifting it would, but in powerlifting it wouldn't. Then let's flip to the other end, right, is the unloaded. Okay, so training with no load and moving it as fast as you can. Huge improvement in velocity, no improvement in force. Anything times zero is zero, right? When it wasn't actually zero, it was really small. So we saw that power improved, but it was only a little bit, but it did go straight up, and maybe even slightly to the left, meaning that you could call upon that power more easily and call upon it sooner. You hit that peak power sooner. Then there were left the 30 and 60% loads. Well, the biggest improvements in power happened at 30%, and that's no surprise if you look at the research, right? Where does peak power occur? Usually somewhere between 30 and 60% on most lifts. Of course, the joint matters, the fiber type matters, the pronation matters, and all those things. So really, if you look at any textbook that's good, they'll actually have a super wide range of where peak power occurs, between 30 and 100%, because the joint, you can't you have just one set, because every joint and the integration of joints is going to matter. But back to the point that the 30%, there was a okay improvement in force. There was a large improvement in velocity. It had the biggest improvement in power, and it went straight up. 60% was the Goldilocks load, right? Where you had equal improvements in force and velocity, and you had the second biggest improvement in power. And it again went nearly straight up. So I tell all of that because every person is going to have a weak link. They're going to have a weakness. And if you can just go in and dial into where that weakness is in your own training, you can make the lift go, if you're a power lifter, you can make your 1RM go up better. Now, it's like, how? If I'm training light and fast, well, you just said speed and force, that interaction, whatever. Okay, let's think about it. And whenever I first started training Westside Barbell and started doing the dynamic effort, all of a sudden my lifts were going up fast. Like the actual concentric portion was going up faster. And then I could use that momentum of sort, or inertia really, I guess is probably the better term for it, that I would blast through my sticking point. And then that caused my lifts to continue to increase. Now, I did have to continue to work on the special strengths for those sticking points. But those light loads, that's where I sucked at. And then that was the low-hanging fruit. That got better. Then my competition total got better. Now, that's also going to have a ceiling. It's not going to say that just by doing the same 60% for 8 sets of 3 or 12 sets of 2 or whatever it might happen to be, that that's going to make everything better all the time. No, it's not. You're going to have to find different voids to fill. But just use the low-hanging fruit while it's there to see those improvements and those adaptations. And if you're not doing that, I think it's ludicrous, because again, I call it low-hanging fruit for a reason. You can see these great improvements in performance from a small change to your training program.
Mm-hmm. No, that definitely makes sense. And I think, I appreciate the clarity around that. And so one of the things I guess maybe I'd like you to expand on was because you talked about, or you kind of referenced upstream and downstream benefits, and you kind of talked about it being the left or the right. Can you sort of go into that a little bit more? Because I don't think some of the people who are listening might have the kind of context to understand that.
Yeah, you're right. I haven't had all the rest of my classes. I'm up here explaining it, referring to studies that I talk about in class all the time. So by the left and the right, I mean at the time at which peak power occurs, right? Or you could even look at it as the load at which peak power occurs. And then, so if we look at it from a load power perspective as opposed to a time power perspective, a load power would show that what does this person need to improve upon? If they do sorry about that. If they do, if they're hitting peak power at like 70%, and they're supposed to be 30 to 40%. It's like, well, we know that the low-hanging fruit here would be the velocity into the spectrum. So if we get them stronger, if we get them, give them a velocity emphasis, they're probably going to get a little bit stronger. Because, and then let's get back to it. Keep going before I jump around. Conversely, if somebody was at like 10%, well, we would know that they need to get stronger if they're hitting peak power at 10%. And that's without the inclusion of body mass, because then that starts muddying up the waters. What's the main listenership that you've got here, Daniel?
Mostly, I'd say a good combination of like coaches, but mostly it's like strength and hypertrophy.
Strength and hypertrophy. Okay, so then we won't really need to worry so much on that for the power. It's like, for speed and everything else. But on the flip side of it too, gosh, I forgot where I was going because my phone started ringing. I had to check and make sure it wasn't my wife, kid emergency. Clear. Okay, and then it was on the time. The time to peak power, what I'm really referring to there is that outside of powerlifting, power is a rate-limited activity, right? You've only got so much time to produce peak power. So if I make peak power go up, but it takes too long to get there, right? It takes too long to produce that power. It's not usable because it's not going to be called upon because my activity is already complete. What I mean by that is if it takes me 0.6 seconds, just throwing something out randomly, let's say it takes 0.6 seconds for me to hit peak power, but I have 0.2 seconds to produce force for this activity. Well, that increase of power that I got is 0.4 seconds too late, right? It's like the shot already went up, it went into the goal, and now somebody jumps up to block the shot or get the rebound after the play is already done. It doesn't make any sense. So that's just one of those context dependent things. Like increasing peak power is good, but increasing peak power when it's not usable is bad. Well, I'm not going to say bad, but it's not necessarily the smartest thing in the world. The goal is to keep the goal the goal, and let's not waste time, at least from my standpoint, looking at that. So I really like looking at it from that standpoint, the time to peak power and the loads at which peak power occur. Because those are two super low-hanging fruits. Those are really, really easy to change. It's like, how do you change it? If they're hitting peak power at too heavy of a load or it's taking too long, give them light weights and make them jump. Right? And do drop jumps, not depth or anything like that. I'm sure they're not ready for it because that takes like 6 or 8 months to prepare for. And if guess what? If they're weaker than a kitten, well, that'll pop up on their relative force at minimum displacement or force at zero velocity, depending on what your system you're using and what country you're in. If that's low, then just get them stronger. I think that we really could take it back to just a few variables and make training super simple, and I think there's going to be better results because I know that every time that I have tried to science the shit out of the program and make it like the most coolest program because I'm bored, well, those are always the ones that get the least results. So I think that we need to just go simple, look for the big rocks, the low-hanging fruit, fix those, and and then just doing that probably takes up 3 or 4 years of training. And then at the end of those 3 or 4 years, it's like, what do you do next? It's a good question. I don't know, because by then they are off into pro sport or they've graduated. So I'm real good at knowing what that 4 to 5 and now with COVID, maybe 6 years of training should look like. After that,